Hello everyone, today I'm going to be testing out this watercolor palette. Now, the first time that I saw one of these watercolor palettes, I was immediately drawn to its setup. As you can see, it's very visually appealing and very unique in its organization with these stacked and movable parts to keep the palette nice and compact. It also comes with this water brush, which I'll be testing out as well in this video, and the last area of the palette is actually a mixable area, which is cool as well. As you can see, it's very compact from the side view. This is the 42 color variety of one of these palettes. There are quite a few brands that make them that also have different color layouts. I'm only going to be talking about this one. I'm not sure if the other brands that make these vary in paint quality. Lots of them definitely look like they have a different color scheme or color selection to them. As far as I can tell, this one is just called the Superior Watercolor 42 set. I got it on Amazon. There are lots of them online, but like I said, not sure if the brands and paint quality change, so this review is mainly just going to be for this particular palette. When I bought mine quite a few months ago now, it was $25.99 Canadian dollars, which for 42 watercolors is a fantastic deal. As far as first impressions go, I was very optimistic about this palette because just looking and feeling the paints, they definitely have some sort of binding agent with them, as opposed to most cheap watercolor palettes have more of a chalky feel. They are grittier, they tend to be not as pigmented, so first impression is very optimistic. For these palettes, there's obviously not a ton of information, like the thing barely has a brand, so there is definitely no information about each color. They are only identified by code names C1, 2, 3, and so on, and therefore there's no light fastness, which for the price I'm going to assume that they're probably all synthetic shades and therefore not light fast, which if you're looking at this as a possible beginner palette is obviously not going to be an issue for you, but if you are a more experienced artist and possibly looking at this as a travel palette, it is definitely something to keep in mind. The only concern that I somewhat have is to the amount of paint that you actually get in each of these sections. You saw from before, each of the swinging palette parts is quite thin, so you obviously don't get a ton of paint for each of the colors, but as watercolors normally go, it is probably going to last you quite a long time. The only concern that I would have is once you start actually wearing through to the plastic part, if that paint is actually going to staying in that section anymore, or if it's just going to start falling out. For the test that I ended up doing that you will see later in the video, I did end up using quite a lot of the indigo shade, which as you can see made a bit of an indent, but definitely nothing that went to the plastic part of the palette, so you do get a decent amount of color for each pan. Now for all of the swatches, I was extremely impressed with how these paints swatched. They seem to have blended out beautifully when I dragged the color to make it more translucent on the end of the swatches, and yeah, as you can see, they are extremely pigmented. The color layout was a little different in a few areas, but overall it's pretty much the standard color variants, starting off with the yellow, although the white is at the very beginning, which most of the time in palettes it would be at the end with the black, but pretty standard color layout as far as watercolor palettes go. Here's a swatch sheet comparison of the Superior 42 watercolors and the Winsor Newton Cotman colors, which is one of my all-time favorite and most used palettes. Now, as for the Winsor Newton Cotman colors, those blanked out ones are paints that I have added to the palette. That's why I blanked them out, because I just want to compare the original sets. And yeah, as you can see, the color scheme is fairly similar between the two, and like I mentioned before, I am super impressed with the Superior 42 colors. They are great, especially for the price. They swatch beautifully. As you can see between the two, they are very similar in pigmentation, swatching, color layout, all of that kind of stuff. If I was going to be really picky with the superior colors, I would say that I kind of wish the black was possibly more opaque. As you can see in the Cotman set, you do get two different blacks, and even the more translucent black is still more opaque than the one in the 42 color set. But like I said, that's just me being picky. The only other thing I could think of when I was using this palette is I kind of wish that there was a Payne's Gray or a darker purple, maybe swapping out one of the greens. I know that C23 and C25 are very similar, so you probably could do without one of them, and I would have preferred if they had added in maybe another brown, a deeper brown. That was kind of the other not issue, but the other recommendation I guess I would have for this set is you are kind of missing like a nice deep pigmented brown, which if you are using it for more natural color schemes and portraits and stuff, you might miss in this set, but the overall color selection is great. The other thing that I wanted to mention, at least for this particular watercolor set, is some of the color placements are a little strange. As you can see, it kind of goes from the reds to this really deep kind of plum maroon shade, and then it kind of jumps to these terracotta shades, and then it jumps to purple, and then it jumps to green, which, as you can see in the Cotman colors, it does not do that. It's a very smooth transition between the pinks to the purples to the blues to the greens, and then you get into more of the natural and terracotta shades. But like I said, definitely not a deal breaker, just kind of something to work around. You definitely would probably want to create a swatch sheet, especially because the purple pans are very dark, and so you might completely forget that you even have purple in this palette if you didn't do a swatch sheet, because they are kind of in the middle with everything else. The other thing is there is actually quite a few unique shades in this palette. The C18 color, which is like a bluey purple, is actually a color that I ended up adding into my Daniel Smith collection because that bluey purple color is quite a rare color in watercolor, and so if that is a color that you're using a lot, you definitely want to have one pre-mixed. So I was really happy to see that, although on the other hand, I kind of wish that there was more of a pinky magenta-y color like the Purple Lake and Magenta in the Cotman set, but overall a great color range in the 42 color palette. We know that the colors swatch beautifully, but how well do they actually perform when doing a painting? I decided to test them a couple of times for you all. The first one I decided to do a more natural color scheme portrait style of these eyes to give an idea of how well they layer and how well you can achieve natural tones. I know with most palettes they are very vibrant colors, and you really want to be able to see how well you can mix them down to create more skin tone shades and neutral shades. And overall, my impression of these was great. This is where I kind of realized that I was missing having a deeper sepia brown. Sometimes the black just doesn't cut it, it dulls it down too much, or you are having too much of a vibrant brown for the other colors that you're having to mix in to create a deeper brown. But other than that, I was very impressed with how these watercolors performed. I also decided to exclusively use the water brush pen that comes with the palette, and I was also very impressed with that as well. It is definitely one of the nicer water pens that you can get. The brush tip itself likes to keep its shape a lot, which means you have a lot of control with it. You can definitely get more broad strokes, but you can also keep it to the very tip and get a very precise brush stroke with this pen. It also seems to have a larger water reservoir than a lot of brush pens, which is great as well. I would very happily travel exclusively with this palette and brush pen as my main watercolor set. I've been using the mixing area on the back of the watercolor palette for this whole drawing as well. And here I just decided to finish up this sketch with a soft leaded pencil and some white gel pen just to add in some highlights. Now, the first test went great, but I really wanted to test out how well the colors worked on their own, as well as how well they layered. A big problem with lots of more inexpensive watercolors is that when you try and add another layer of color, the watercolor underneath that likes to lift off of the page. One of the best ways to test how well watercolors like lifting off or staying put is a galaxy. I also wanted to see how well they liked blending together, so that's why I decided to do the gradient underneath the galaxy section. The galaxy ended up turning out pretty perfectly. The colors didn't really like lifting off when I added more. The gradient, however, was a slightly different story. I did try and see how well I could pull up some color, and I'm not sure if it was just these particular colors that I was using in the gradient that might be more lift-off prone than the galaxy colors, but I did have more of an issue with lift-off in the gradient area as opposed to the galaxy. The liftoff is pretty minimal, and it's definitely something that you can learn to work around, so it's really not much of a deal breaker, especially considering how budget-friendly this palette is. I'm just having to build up a couple more layers on the bottom section just to add some more depth and to deepen up some of the darker colors. And I'm just finishing the galaxy off here with my usual acrylic ink on a toothbrush and then adding some white highlights with a white gel pen. Overall, I am extremely impressed and pleased with this palette. I think it would be a fantastic option for a beginner artist just starting out with watercolor, as well as even for more experienced artists that just want a fun new travel set or just a fun new palette to use. I can definitely see myself using this palette a lot on the go, or even just to use something different around my studio. And that is my review of the Superior 42 watercolor palette. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in my next video.